This is a review video for our second reading quiz. In week one, we studied slavery in the prison system, starting with definitions of land bond versus chattel slavery. Looking back into history, slavery was a feature of most ancient societies, ancient Rome, ancient Greece, Europe, Egypt, and so on. Most of these ancient societies featured what we call land bond slavery, and in this system, slaves were usually prisoners of war, debtors, convicts, or children of slaves, and generally served a government or a city-state. Chattel slavery seems to have evolved more commonly about the year 1200 forward with the Atlantic slave trade. What that means is that when you have slaves who are owned by individuals as private property. So, not to say that one or the other did or did not exist at particular times, but we think about chattel slavery as being more commonly associated with American slavery or the Western European slave trade, the Atlantic slave trade, and land bond slavery as being kind of a more ancient notion. On the extent and the likely modern influences, we know about 1/3 of Southern families owned slaves, and while ownership was less common in the North, the Northern economy benefited from trade in textiles, tobacco, cotton, and other crops that were grown with slave labor. So some results which are likely attributable to the institution of slavery. Academically, we have limited writings on equality and distributive justice until kind of more modern period. We have this preclusion to property ownership, inequality resulting from property ownership, prison education systems, and the perpetuation or maintenance of a class hierarchy. All right, so you wouldn't necessarily need to have these memorized, these influences, but maybe pick one from a list that was not a likely influence of the institution of slavery. Our first reading out of this section is the Haney-Lopez reading on race prerequisites. We know that Congress restricted naturalization of citizenship to white persons in 1790, and then especially post-abolition, then there were a number of cases to determine what a white person is. So I outline a couple of these cases in the note, but ultimately we focus on two Supreme Court decisions, which ruled in favor of common knowledge understanding. And so as a result of this, because whiteness is a common knowledge understanding, it can be applied in different ways at different times. It's worth maybe taking a look in here at this slide I have on our two Supreme Court cases. So we have Ozawa versus the United States and the US versus Tind. You don't need to memorize these cases or know the details about the cases, but what you do need to know is ultimately they arrive at this common speech understanding of the words free white persons, which can be interpreted in accordance with the understanding of common man. Our second reading then is on the Jim Crow laws, and first the author starts out, Roback starts out by describing what the Jim Crow laws were. You have 4 Jim Crow laws: vagrancy, enticement, contract enforcement, and immigrant agent. Vagrancy meaning that you have to have proof that you have a home or you can be jailed. Enticement refers to potential employers. Potential employers cannot try to hire people who are on existing labor contracts. And likewise, contract enforcement, meaning that if you're a worker and you're on a labor contract, you can't accept a different job. Finally, we have the appearance of these immigrant agent laws, which restrict people from recruiting laborers in the South. In order to recruit laborers in the South, you would have to register with a county, with each county, and pay a very large fee to recruit labor. So the fee was so large that it prohibited most people from doing that. Our reading also talks a little bit about some laws that have appeared or perhaps replaced Jim Crow laws. They may have existed in some form during the Jim Crow period, but Roback talks about poll taxes and literacy laws as being ultimately a replacement for the Jim Crow laws. So we kind of shifted from the Jim Crow era into the poll tax and literacy law era of voting regulation. So finally, in terms of understanding the Jim Crow laws and the intent of the Jim Crow laws, Robach argues that we should understand the Jim Crow laws as an attempt at a labor market cartel. So they want to enforce the labor market cartel, want to keep wages low for the working class, especially among Black workers who had formerly been slaves and paid very little or nothing. And then to a lesser extent, or possibly continuing to enforce this social hierarchy, which had existed through slavery and probably before that time. Right, so in general, that's what the Jim Crow laws are. What were they for? Racism wouldn't have been sufficient on its own to enforce low wages for the working class population. There were too many opportunities to move out of the South, to take jobs at factories, to participate in the Industrial Revolution. And so as a result, these Jim Crow laws are an attempt to enforce legally a labor market cartel, which keeps wages low, limits labor mobility, and in some sense, perpetuates the social hierarchy existing. Out of this, violations of the Jim Crow law and other laws would have been punishable by servitude on chain gangs and in mine crews. So by debt peonage, we just mean requiring a certain amount of labor in exchange for freedom. And during this time period, many of the workers on the chain gangs or mine crews would have been convicts that had been tried in court, but others were forced into debt peonage in order to escape trial. So if you were someone who was accused of a crime and you believed that the jury would not have been very fair to you, or that you were likely to be found guilty regardless, you would likely serve on the chain gangs or a certain amount of debt peonage to avoid going to that jury trial. Right, so many of these people were convicts, others were simply accused. Finally, we have one additional reading on the prison system and the likely modern influences of the prison system. And this is actually a very interesting book from Angela Davis titled Are Prisons Obsolete? We only read out of one chapter there, but I do recommend it as a reading for other people who are interested in kind of modern prison. And ultimately, I think Davis suggests some alternatives, provides a bunch of interesting statistics, but we have kind of two fields of main influences from the prison system. One, very similar to the Jim Crow laws. The prison system limits labor mobility, similar to Jim Crow laws, may have limited the ability of Black Americans to take part in the westward expansion, land ownership, and intergenerational wealth that comes with it. So there's one aspect, and then Davis also notes the influence on social and labor market stereotypes, so prisons and the prison system, the results of the prison system, enforcing and perpetuating stereotypes about non-whites as being violent criminals who are generally less capable owing to their own shortcomings. Right, there's some interesting research being conducted on this, especially in terms of blind resume audit studies in economics, and so I described that a little bit in class today, but that's something else that someone who's interested in prisons and prison systems might also be interested in implicit bias in job opportunities. So that is week one. Out of week two, we talked about Marx, and from Marx we have just a series of definitions basically. So we'll start with the working class or proletariat, which is a group of subsistence laborers who have to sell their labor power to capitalists or to the bourgeoisie, the owners of the means of production, in exchange for money used to survive. To Marx, the working class or the proletariat would be anybody who sees work as being separate from life, just a part of life, which is a requirement in order to engage in leisure activities or have money to live. And the working class would generally have no ownership over the means of production, generally meager or no private property. Right, so our second class of people is the bourgeoisie. These are the owners of the means of production. And it's worth noting that these wouldn't necessarily have been the only types of people who exist in the world to Marx, but these are kind of the two classes of interest. The relationship of these two classes is ultimately what drives the future shaping of capitalism and revolution. But there would have been other people. Marx gives the example of the watchmaker. So that's a laborer who does get to take pride in their work, sell their work at market. All right, we have this Marxian definition of capital, which is sort of an abstract definition. Capital is just an entity which is bought and sold with the sole purpose of further buying and selling. So in class, I gave the example of a coffee machine for a coffee shop. Generally, a coffee shop would buy a coffee machine with the sole purpose of producing coffees to sell on the market. Right, so capital exists only because of labor. Without labor, capital has no function. The coffee machine, without laborers to work it, doesn't produce coffee. Your computer wouldn't have existed in the time of Marx, obviously, but that's a powerful piece of capital that, generally speaking, does very little if it has no worker to operate it. But at the same time, labor is dependent on capital. In order to improve wages, productivity, standards of living, the worker must make improvements to capital, ultimately increasing the value of capital, increasing the profits of the owners of capital, and allowing more wage laborers to be called into existence. So then in Marx, the relationship between the working class, the proletariat, and capital is a relationship of wage slavery. The worker has no choice but to commit the vast majority of their productive livelihood to using and improving capital. The ownership class becomes wealthier as the value of capital grows, and so more and more wage workers are called into existence. And again, the only escape from wage labor is to improve one's productivity by improving capital, thereby making capital more valuable and more powerful. It's in the interest of the bourgeoisie to maintain a population of unemployed people as a threat to the working class. This ultimately helps perpetuate this relationship between capital and the working class and leading into exploitation. But the reserve army of the unemployed is just a group of unemployed people who act as a threat to the employed. And so in class, we talked a little bit about real world or modern examples of this. One example was at the Amazon warehouses, where people have to fulfill a certain quota or else they may be fired and replaced. In general, the reserve army of the unemployed is just this threat that if you don't like your wages or your job, then we'll get rid of you and replace you with somebody who will do it. So it reduces bargaining power for the worker, main tool of exploitation. All right, so what is exploitation? In Marx, exploitation occurs when the capitalist extracts a marginal product of labor which exceeds the cost of labor. This could occur in a couple of ways. Two of the most common are if profits increase but workers don't share in the gains, or if monopolists are able to drive wages lower. So these are two types of exploitation. And Marx believed that over time, the increases in the value of capital created by the labor of the working class would make capital and the owners of capital more powerful. Marx feared that this pressure of monopolization ultimately concentrates ownership of the means of production into a small ownership class. So you have a small ownership class which is able to exploit or extract surpluses off of the work of a very large and destitute working class. So then why is this a problem? Ultimately, Marx believes that people become alienated from their livelihoods in the following ways. They become alienated from the final product. They don't get to be proud of their creation or take it to market and sell and enjoy in the profits. They don't understand the productive process or build human capital related to the process or the production of the particular good. A worker would not generally be able to branch off and open their own factory with the knowledge and human capital gained at their job. Alienation from the self, meaning that wage workers have to give up their passion pursuits or interests in order to sell their productive time for money, and there's an emotional cost to that. And then also alienation from others, because the realities of day-to-day life as a factory worker, as a wage worker, meant limited interaction, limited quality of life, and so on. So Marx believes ultimately that the working class is going to be exploited by an ever more powerful ownership class, causing more and more alienation to the point at which the working class becomes so happy with their life and conditions that they revolt, reclaiming ownership of the means of production. And finally, we didn't talk too much about the Communist Manifesto, but many of Marx's predictions and most notorious predictions come out of the Communist Manifesto. There's a section in which Marx indicates what he believes will be the demand of the working class post-revolution. Some of them match progressive policies of today, improvements in education, public services, slavery and child labor abolition. One which does not is the prediction that the workers would demand the abolition of private property and inheritance. And so this is the theory that we associate most commonly, I would say, with communism, the reduced emphasis on private property, and ultimately Marx is known as a communist because of this Communist Manifesto, but in particular the prediction from the Communist Manifesto that post-revolution the working class would demand abolition of private property and inheritance. Right, so I take a second here to define capitalism, socialism, and communism in an economic sense. And the most important features of these definitions economically are first and foremost ownership of the means of production, with a secondary emphasis on the existence of private property. So on the ownership of means of production in capitalism, it's firms, corporations who own the means of production, and sometimes individuals own these corporations. In socialism, it's the workers who own the means of production. So something like New Belgium, perhaps. And in command communism, you have a central authority or a government who owns the means of production. So private property is consistent with capitalism and socialism, less widespread in command communist economies. In week 3, we have theories on the transition to capitalism and separately what we call the marginalist revolution or marginalism in economics, which is responsible for the majority of what you might consider microeconomics, 202, 306 material. On the transition to capitalism, there's a general theoretical approach that capitalism either evolved from within the framework of feudalism, eventually taking over, or it evolved separately alongside the framework of feudalism and eventually overtook as the most common economic governance. We see 2 approaches from Moore and Brenner, which summarize this line of discussion, but argue that there are important institutional factors which have been left out of this debate. So first of all, what is the crisis of feudalism during about the 13th to 15th century? We see that there was a period where there was decreasing land productivity and decreasing income per capita, but there was also increasing population, which reduced standard of living and creates civil unrest. And during this time period, it seemed that feudalism was not going to be sustainable as a system of economic governance. So how did we get from feudalism into capitalism as the most common system of governance? Again, you have the general theoretical approach that these markets may have evolved separately. They may have evolved kind of out of feudalism. Moore makes an argument that the crisis of feudalism was actually kind of a Malthusian agricultural crisis. Feudal relations tended to reduce incentive to invest in land and agricultural techniques, but they also encouraged population growth. And so the result of this is you see a lack of investment into public health, results in the bubonic plague, which rebalances land and labor ratio in favor of the working class. I noted to the class today, I saw within the last couple of days, there was a Reddit post kind of similar to this, which made its way to pretty much the top of the front page, and it drew a lot of critique from historian and economists. So it just goes to show that there's still considerable debate about this to the present day. Brenner is arguing, alternatively, that the transition to capitalism was marked more by the maintenance of this socio-political hierarchy. So first of all, the feudal needs seem to have shaped the development of industry. Brenner gives some examples of industries in France as being shaped by feudal needs, especially the wool industry in a particular place. And then when we look into the Soviet Union and former communist countries, we also seem to see the existence of these kind of industry cities or factory cities, where most of the people in the city or in the area work for the factory or do things related to that particular industry. So it seems to be that when you have a command sort of system, it shapes development of industry in a particular way or localizes it into various places. So there was this influence that as industries evolved, and they may have evolved in accordance with the needs and the desires, the demand of the feudal class. Also, Brenner notes that some of the more successful early capitalists had ties to the existing political elite. So one good example of this would be the East India Trading Company and their ties to the British Crown. People who were able to receive loans, receive capital from governments in order to engage in trade were in general better off. Taken together, these arguments tend to say that factors seem to have come together for these different groups, the feudal class and the capitalist class, to pursue kind of capitalist solutions to these problems. So we have a potential explanation for the rise of the Atlantic slave trade as being an external solution to either the land problem in Moore, right? You don't, you have this Malthusian land crisis, reduction in land productivity. So what do? You try to expand your available lands and workers. And then in the Brenner argument, we have this maintenance of the power structure which existed in feudalism, perpetuated by a slave trade and the existence of a slave working class. Right, so our last topic then out of week 3 is the marginalists and marginalist thinking. I ask ultimately only 2 questions on the marginalists. One is just what is marginalist thinking in general, or what is thinking on the intensive margin? So that's just if you add or take away 1 unit, how does it change quantity? If you add 1 worker, what's the additional production? Or if you eat 1 more apple, eat 1 more good, what's the additional utility gained? Contrast that to the extensive margin, which deals with total quantities, not adding or taking away 1 input. So that's, what is the intensive margin? The intensive margin is adding or taking away 1 input and seeing how it changes totals. And then on slide 28, I list a number of influences of the marginalists, especially on Marshall, especially to microeconomics. And from here, you would just basically want to be able to pick an item off of a list that doesn't belong. So let's have a look here at Marshall. And I don't need you to memorize this whole list. We could have taken another week to, derive all of these theories, but you see them in 202, 306. So basically this question is going to be phrased as which of the following would not be attributable to marginalist theory. 3 of them are going to be kind of basically off of here, and then 1 of them should be clearly attributable to one of our previous non-marginalist economists up to Marx. Okay, so widespread influence of the marginalists, generally speaking, most of modern microeconomics coming out of the marginalist thought. We sped through it to a certain degree because I didn't want to derive all of these individual topics, but you should be aware of what they are and what sort of topic would not belong on that list. Right, so that does it for review. Feel free to shoot me an email if you have any questions.